In today's Elden Ring video, we'll take a look at 10 secrets and hidden mechanics that you probably didn't know about. A lot of them will help you a lot in better understanding how to take advantage of the various gameplay mechanics or provide your character with bonus effects that you can't otherwise get. Also, before we jump in, a quick shout out to Instant Gaming for sponsoring today's video. If you like game discounts and want to buy games at some of the best prices, check out Instant Gaming using my links down below. Whenever a new game launches, and even after, they always sell them at some of the best discounts around. Now, coming up to number 1, Elden Ring is a very complex game, and you'd be surprised to know that even the weather has an effect on your character and its stats. If you stay out during rainy days, you'll notice that your lightning resistance will go down while the fire absorption will go up. And this goes for every other enemy as well, which means you can use this at your own advantage in a lot of interesting ways. For example, if you cast a lightning spell during a sunny weather, it's not going to deal that much damage compared to how much it can deal during a rainy day or when the enemy is wet. You'll see that there's a significant difference in damage between these two scenarios, but it doesn't just stop there. Staying in water also makes every lightning spell to now also have an AoE that spreads pretty far and deals extra damage from the point of impact. So the ideal situation would be to be both inside a lake or a puddle while it's raining outside, as this applies both of these stat changes at the same time, especially for lightning builds. It's not only weather though that affects your character in different ways. The poison mud or scarlet rot also accumulates on your clothes and has different effects. You likely notice that a status like poison or rot, for example, will continue to rise even after you exited the contaminated area, and that's because you likely got a lot of stains on your clothes. So the more dirty your clothes are with that element, the more buildup over time you will have, which is why a simple bar of soap comes in so handy, as it doesn't just remove the buildup over time from your clothes, but also a portion of the buildup on the bar next to your character. Moving on to number 2, you can find the ultimate assassin's tool in Stormveil Castle. If you head over to the room on the 2nd floor of the castle, you'll find a mimic veil inside this chest by the side of the grand table. Now this comes in handy as it lets you mimic elements of your nearby environment to conceal your character from any suspecting enemy. It works so well, in fact, that you can literally break aggro if you cast it just outside of the enemy's line of sight. This might continue to make them a bit more suspicious for a few more moments, but eventually they will just give up as the AI is not that smart, point at which you can do whatever you want. You can even move behind them or ambush them. It's a great option to do so without ever being noticed unless they physically see you moving. Moving on to number 3, there's a way to fast cast or true cast into a lot of the incantations in the game, turning their very long wind-ups pretty much into instant casts. One of my favorite is the Catch Flame plus the Magma Breath or Theodoric's Magma. By itself, if you just use the Magma Breath, you will notice that it has a pretty long wind up and it can be easily interrupted. Well, if you first start with a Catch Flame or a Bestial Sling, you can then follow up with a true cast into the Magma Breath, making it instant and a lot more devastating than it is on its own. It's an amazing combo to have since you can combine 2 damage sources at the same time and then unleash the magma for additional damage. It's even better if you use it with the Bestial Sling, since that gives you a lot more reach with the longer range on the spell, and more important, you can also stun enemies in just a couple of true casts. Another variant is also the Dragon Claw one. You can use the Catch Flame or Bestial Sling with this just as you did with the Magma Breath. In this case, you're going to remove that slowish kind of wind up, and instead you're just going to have the jump, which is quite a nice way of catching enemies off guard or just using it as a gap closer when the enemies run away from you. Now moving on to number 4, this can also be done for sorceries, and as a matter of fact, there's a lot more fast cast options for sorceries than there are for incantations. Basically, every single fast cast can start from a weaker spell variant into a much stronger one that usually takes longer to have that initial cast on. For example, you can start with a Swift Glintstone Pebble, Soul, since this is probably the fastest that you will ever get, and then immediately switch to something like a Comet Shard or even a Comet to completely bypass their starting wind-up animation and instead just get the instant casts. You can even use 3 or possibly more spell chains that you can then just go through to fast cast the slowest one that completely bypasses the wind-up but deals the highest damage possible. There's other combos though. Of course, you can use something like the Spiral Shard. If you start with a Swift Pebble, then follow up with the Spiral Shard and constantly switch between these, you completely remove the wind up on the spiral, and this means you can just overwhelm the enemy with so many attacks. It's so powerful in fact that it can deal huge amounts of damage even with the uncharged version, and more important, you can also stun them fully, which comes in quite handy. A third variant would be using the Carrion Greatsword with the Adula's Blade. Now, Carrion Greatsword is a little bit faster in its initial wind up, so you can use that if you're in melee range, and if the enemy jumps away, you can immediately switch to the Adula's Blade, bypass its initial wind up, and just follow up with subsequent attacks, as well as the range on the Frost attack, which definitely comes in handy. Moving on to number 5, let's talk about a few very useful items that will definitely help you, especially in tight spots. And this brings us to the Beast Repellent Torch and the Sentry Torch. Now, the Beast Repellent Torch, you can find this at the Isolated Merchant over in Caelid, and this is an amazing option when navigating sewers or caves infested with beasts, like for example rats, wolves, or even bears if you find yourself in some of these Mistwood locations. This makes them way less likely to attack you, to the point that many of them will not attack you at all unless you attack them first or get them back into a corner. This is my go-to item whenever I go into rat-infested territories, as it kinda subdues them, but it also works very well on wolves and especially on these bears. Another variant would be the Sentry Torch. This is something you buy from the Hermit Merchant right here in the Altus Plateau, and this is the best to reveal invisible enemies, especially if you fight against some of these Black Knife enemies. I found this to work best against the Black Knife Assassin in the Sage's Cave to remove its invisibility veil, so you can pretty much see him in the entirety of that room. It also seems to have a much longer range than the area that it lights up, so you don't have to sacrifice too much in terms of seeing the enemy and can still keep your distance. It doesn't seem to reveal invisible scarabs though, and neither does it do so for invisible walls, unless we're talking about the ones specifically in the Sage's Cave, as they seem to be the only ones that are affected by the Sentry Torch, but everything else does not. Moving on to number 6, if you ever felt overwhelmed by the number of enemies attacking you, well, there's a way to transform them into your allies. So let's begin with the Crystal Darts. This can be used to pin especially the Golem enemies against one another. So this includes the small imps, the big golems, and even like some of these bosses you can find in certain dungeons. You can easily find 8 of these in the second room by the side of Grace in the Altus Tunnel, but there's also a way to craft these you can find online. Now, if you throw enough of these darts into these enemies, you can essentially cause them to enter a frenzy, which turns them up against anything in sight, including their own allies. In the case of the imps, it only takes a couple of these darts, but in the case of some of the bigger enemies, you will need about 5 or 6, but it's totally worth it. It definitely is a nice sight to see 2 of these gigantic enemies attacking each other. It's definitely something that you don't see every single day, but more important, it's useful against some of these boss enemies in case you feel overwhelmed. It's a nice way to distract them and maybe even get them to kill each other, so you just reap the benefits. Moving on to number 7, there's also an alternative to this, but for human enemies, which is the Bewitching Branch. This is an even more efficient tool, as it does work on these enemies. It only has to be casted once, but once you do so, you can even turn some of the boss summons against their own bosses, like for example in the encounter against Commander Niall. I found that these 2 summons are very effective against the boss itself, dealing nice damage and also providing a distraction, even if you at the very least just stay in the back to watch how fun it is for them to take down their own boss. Moving on to number 8, you might have unlocked any of the 7 great boss runes, and the game even leads you to believe you can easily apply them by using them as a site of grace, but that merely equips them, it doesn't actually give you anything just yet. To activate their passive bonuses, you also need to use something called a rune arc. You can find these in random places throughout the world, or even when defeating hosts in PvP, but they are the ones that you need to activate in order to get the benefits from those great runes. Luckily, the effect doesn't have a cooldown on it, so once you apply it, it will work indefinitely, but if you happen to fall off in combat or die, the effect will get removed, so you will need to reapply it again to get the benefit from the great rune. Moving on to number 9, if you ever hated the choices you had to make when giving a boss remembrance to the NPC, there's actually a way to duplicate it and also get the second reward from that specific boss, and this brings us to the mausoleum enemies. You likely spot at least a few of these. There's 7 of them in total in the game. They look like giant rocks with 4 legs and obviously a mausoleum on top, but you can literally bring them on their knees by simply hitting them in the legs, specifically in the skeleton looking rock formations. After you've done that for a little bit, they will eventually kneel, so you can enter inside and duplicate any existing remembrance. Now this works even for remembrances that you have already used. As long as you defeated the boss, you can go ahead and duplicate it even if it was already claimed. It only works, by the way, for the second item that you didn't claim, so you cannot duplicate an item from the same boss unless you start a new game plus. And at the same time, there are 2 different types of mausoleums. The ones with the bells let you pretty much claim almost any remembrance in the game, while the ones without any bell will only give you a selection to mostly some of the secondary bosses, so do keep that in mind. And because you have a limited access to mausoleums, you won't be able to duplicate every single remembrance in the game, so choose wisely. And finally, to number 10, another useful damage increase buff that comes for free is the fact that you can get any weapon buff even if you don't necessarily use it in combat, as long as you just equip it in the offhand. We already went over the fact that having 2 gravelstone seals can be used at the same time to get 2 times of the dragon cult incantation bonus damage in yesterday's video, but there's obviously a lot more creative results that you can apply for your own build. For example, in the case of sorceries, you can use a Lusat staff in the right hand to get the maximum damage and have it as a primary cast staff, but then also have a secondary one in the left hand, like for example in this case the meteorite staff, to buff up like a gravity spell and get both of the bonuses at the same time. It works pretty much with any other type of staff that buffs a certain class of sorceries, so you can make the most out of them and get the maximum damage. It also works for melee, by the way. In this case, one of the best examples is using something like the Serpent God Sword in the offhand. Even if you don't fully upgrade this, or even if you don't meet its requirements, you can still get the passive heal on kill effect that you normally get from it, even if you perform those kills with a different weapon or a different source of damage. But this is it with some of these secrets. Totally let me know down below if there's anything else that you might have discovered in Elden Ring, and I'll see you guys